Before the city was fully awake, there were already people moving quietly through apartments so large that footsteps seemed to vanish into the carpets. A housekeeper might begin in the kitchen before sunrise. A doorman might be handing up newspapers still cool from the street. In certain buildings along Fifth Avenue, Park Avenue, and Central Park West, the morning began not with haste, but with insulation. The noise of New York was there, certainly, but muted by thick glass, heavy drapes, private elevators, and the reassuring fact that someone else was already preparing the day. It is easy, looking back at the 1990s, to imagine wealth in New York as one long glittering party. The decade is remembered through flashes of Blacktown cars, restaurant openings, fashion shows, charity galas, and names that circulated with such frequency that they came to feel almost architectural, as fixed in the city as limestone facades and brass revolving doors. But daily life at the very top was not simply glamorous. It was organized, buffered, ritualized, and often strangely narrow. The richest New Yorkers possessed extraordinary freedom in theory, yet their days were shaped by habits, expectations, social codes, and anxieties that could be as confining in their own way as any ordinary routine. To understand what life was really like for the very rich in 1990s New York, it helps to begin not with spectacle but with structure. Wealth on this level was not just a matter of having money in the bank. It was a system of living. It determined where one slept, how one moved through the city, which doors opened easily, which schools children entered, which doctors took private calls, which clubs admitted one without question, and which mistakes could be softened by staff, discretion, or distance. It also determined what had to be maintained. An image, a standard, a social presence, a particular kind of apartment, a summer plan, a winter plan, a charitable profile, and above all the impression that one belonged naturally in a world most people only glimpsed from the sidewalk. For some, that world was inherited. Old families still occupied a powerful place in the city's imagination, even if the 1990s were increasingly shaped by finance, media, real estate, and newer forms of money. Certain names still carried the residue of earlier New York, of private schools, old clubs, family foundations, and apartments held for generations. But the decade also belonged to people whose fortunes were newer, louder, and tied to the expanding machinery of late 20th century capitalism. Wall Street bonuses grew. Real estate fortunes rose and fell and rose again. Corporate law, advertising, publishing, television, and luxury retail all fed into an elite culture that was less purely old money than some later nostalgia would suggest. This made the rich world of 1990s New York both stable and unsettled. The old codes remained, but they were being tested by people who had no wish to pretend they had come from somewhere quieter. That tension shaped everything, from interior design to dinner parties. There were still drawing rooms filled with inherited portraits and silver that had survived several generations. But there were also newly renovated penthouses with more glass, sharper edges, bigger closets, private gyms, and bathrooms that resembled small spas. Luxury was shifting from the language of lineage to the language of access and customization. What mattered was no longer only whether something was established. Increasingly, it mattered whether it was exclusive, difficult to secure, and known by the right people. A morning in such a household could appear serene because so much labor had already been hidden. Groceries had been delivered. Clothes had been pressed. Flowers had been arranged, often with the kind of effortlessness that required both money and professional skill. Children were not merely sent to school. They were managed through a sequence of drivers, nannies, tutors, and schedules. A wealthy family's apartment might contain antiques worth more than an ordinary home, but it also had to function as an operating system. Staff knew who preferred breakfast in bed, who wanted strong coffee in a porcelain cup, who liked the financial pages first, and who expected the house phone to be answered on the second ring. This was one of the least romantic parts of extreme wealth, and also one of the most revealing. The richest New Yorkers did not live in ease because their lives were simple. They lived in ease because complexity had been outsourced. In many cases, what they purchased was not luxury in the abstract, but friction removed from daily existence. Someone else found the dress. Someone else rescheduled the dentist. Someone else handled the florist, the repairs, the caterer, the school forms, the missed package, the dinner reservation, the travel confirmations, the errand that could not be forgotten. To be very rich in 1990s New York was to live above an invisible workforce that made spontaneity possible. And yet, the comfort was never complete. There is a tendency to imagine the wealthy as entirely free from inconvenience, but elite life in Manhattan had its own forms of pressure. Apartments had to be defended, improved, and compared. Children had to succeed without embarrassing the family. Marriages had to remain at least publicly intact for as long as they could. Invitations had to be accepted or declined in ways that signaled the correct level of warmth. Tables at the right restaurants were not just places to eat. They were confirmations of rank. Certain women spent entire afternoons in motion between fittings, lunches, committee meetings, and beauty appointments, not because they were idle, but because their appearance in the social world was itself a form of work. That can sound frivolous from a distance, yet it made sense within the ecosystem they inhabited. New York's elite culture in the 1990s still depended heavily on visibility. To be absent too long was to risk becoming less solid in the city's memory. Charity benefits, museum boards, galas, luncheons, and opening nights were not simply entertainment. They were mechanisms through which status was refreshed and alliances maintained. A woman seated on the right committee, photographed at the right event, and associated with the right causes was doing more than attending. She was preserving a place in a social map that could affect family reputation, philanthropic influence, and even business opportunities. If you enjoy history told slowly and with a little more texture, there is plenty more waiting here. For men, especially those connected to finance, law, or real estate, the rhythm was outwardly more practical but no less coded. The tailored suit, the office downtown or in Midtown, the lunch at a club or a power restaurant, the after-hours drink, the discreet call from a driver waiting outside. All of it formed part of a recognizable performance. In the 1980s, this style of masculine success had often been presented almost theatrically. By the 1990s, after market shocks, public scandals, and shifting tastes, the performance became a little more polished, a little less reckless in appearance, though hardly modest. Wealthy men still signaled power through watches, offices, memberships, and addresses, but there was increasing value in seeming controlled. Excess was safer when framed as taste. The apartment itself deserves attention, because in New York real estate was never just shelter. It was biography, armor, and announcement. The richest families did not merely live in desirable neighborhoods. They occupied carefully sorted worlds within them. A co-op on Park Avenue could offer prestige of a very specific kind, but it might also come with boards capable of humiliating even wealthy applicants. That is one of the era's quieter ironies. Great wealth could buy astonishing things, but in some buildings it still had to ask permission. Social acceptance, especially in older institutions, could lag behind financial success. Money opened the door, but sometimes pedigree still examined the shoes. This is where the common fantasy begins to fray. The rich were not all part of one happy ruling class, moving together in relaxed confidence. They were divided by background, style, religion, neighborhood, school ties, age, profession, and especially by how recently the money had arrived. Some people had vast liquidity and very little standing. Others had impeccable names and less cash than they wished the world to assume. Some had all the signs of old New York except peace of mind. Others had enough wealth to reshape entire rooms, yet still felt watched for signs that they did not fully belong. And New York itself was changing beneath them. The city of the 1990s was not the city of later decades. polished for luxury branding and global tourism. Crime fell dramatically over the course of the decade, but memories of the rougher city remained fresh. Many wealthy residents still thought in terms of protected routes, trusted drivers, familiar entrances, and neighborhoods that could shift character block by block. This meant that privilege often expressed itself not only through extravagance, but through managed exposure. One could live in Manhattan while touching only selected parts of it. Car door to lobby, lobby to elevator, elevator to apartment, apartment to event, event to the country house, the Hamptons, Palm Beach, Aspen, or Europe. That pattern created a peculiar kind of urban life. The very rich lived in the center of one of the world's greatest cities, but often inhabited only a narrow and curated version of it. They knew florists, decorators, art advisors, surgeons, private bankers, and maitre d's by first name. They might know less about the ordinary frictions of the subway, public schools, rent increases, or waiting in line than many visitors did after a week. Their New York was intensely local and highly selective. In some ways, it was not the whole city at all, but a soft private network laid on top of it. Even shopping, one of the classic symbols of luxury, was less carefree than it appears in memory. Yes, there were personal shoppers, couture fittings, private rooms, jewelry counters opened after hours, and sales staff trained to remember preferences with unnerving precision. Yet all of this also carried an expectation. One had to buy well, dress appropriately, and avoid the wrong kind of display. The richest women in particular were judged not just for owning expensive things, but for knowing how to own them. Taste was a discipline. To look too eager, too jeweled, too logo-covered, or too new could expose the very insecurity that wealth was meant to conceal. In that sense, elite life in 1990s New York was full of hidden educational systems. Children learned early how to greet adults, how to sit through adult dinners, how to recognize important names, how to move through clubs and restaurants without obvious excitement, and how to speak as if privilege were the natural weather of the world. Accent, posture, clothing, schools, even harmless opinions all mattered. The point was not simply to enjoy wealth, but to reproduce it socially. Families were teaching their children not only how to inherit money, but how to inhabit a class position without appearing to study for it. That could be comfortable, but it could also be cold. The same world that offered beauty, privacy, and insulation was often unforgiving toward weakness, scandal, addiction, overspending, bad marriages, and children who drifted too publicly from expectation. In photographs, 1990s elite New York often looks composed to the point of calm. In practice, many of these lives were held together by discretion. Staff knew things. Schools knew things. Friends knew things. Newspapers, especially the city's tabloids and gossip columns, sometimes knew more than anyone wanted. Reputation was protected through silence where possible, through lawyers where necessary, and through strategic appearances when silence failed. And just beneath the polished surface was a more basic fact. All this luxury depended on a city running around it and beneath it. Cleaners, drivers, cooks, receptionists, nannies, doormen, assistants, messengers, restaurant workers, security staff, hairdressers, tailors, and countless others. The fantasy of effortless wealth was only possible because so many other people's effort had been made to disappear. Once you notice that, the apartments grow less silent. The calm begins to reveal its machinery, and that machinery becomes even more visible when the day moves outward, beyond the apartment and into the rituals of lunch, clubs, business, and public display, where being rich in 1990s New York meant not just possessing money, but performing a certain version of permanence in a city that was always quietly changing. That sense of performance became most visible once the day carried people out of their apartments and into the shared spaces where wealth was quietly measured against itself. Lunch, in particular, held a curious importance. It was not always about the food and often not even about hunger. It was about placement, who sat where, who arrived with whom, who was greeted by name, and who seemed already expected before they had crossed the threshold. Certain restaurants in 1990s New York functioned almost like unofficial offices of the elite. Tables were not merely reserved. They were understood. Regulars did not simply request seating. They returned to a kind of territory. The maitre d' was not just a host but a gatekeeper of subtle hierarchies, able to signal importance with a nod, a delay, or a change of table. A well-known financier or media executive might arrive and be escorted immediately to a preferred corner. Another, equally wealthy but less socially anchored, might wait just long enough to feel the difference. There is a quiet paradox here. Wealth, in theory, should flatten inconvenience. Yet, in these rooms, inconvenience could be reintroduced as a form of sorting. It was not enough to be rich. One had to be recognized as belonging to a particular layer of recognition. This is where reputation moved from the abstract into something almost physical. You could feel it in the way staff approached, in the space left around your table, in how often someone paused to greet you on their way out. Lunch conversations themselves followed a rhythm that was both practical and coded. Deals were discussed, certainly, but rarely in blunt terms. Information moved through suggestion, tone, and shared understanding. Names were dropped carefully, not for effect alone but as signals of access. A casual mention of a weekend in the Hamptons could carry implications about property, neighbors, and social alignment. A passing reference to a board meeting or a benefit dinner might reveal which institutions still mattered and which ones had begun to drift out of central attention. And yet, despite the apparent ease of these interactions, there was often a quiet discipline behind them. The ability to appear relaxed in such environments was itself learned. One did not lean too eagerly into conversation. One did not display urgency unless it could be framed as controlled. Even laughter had a particular tone. Never too loud, never too long, never out of rhythm with the room. It is easy to overlook how much restraint this required. The richest New Yorkers were not simply free to behave as they pleased. They were expected to behave in ways that confirmed they understood the setting. Afternoons often divided along familiar lines. Some returned to offices, where wealth was actively managed, expanded, or protected. Others moved through a sequence of appointments that, while less visibly productive, were no less integral to maintaining status. A woman might move from a charity committee meeting to a fitting at a designer showroom, then to a quiet consultation with a dermatologist or hair specialist, before preparing for an evening event. Each stop was part of a broader system of upkeep, not just of appearance but of presence. This is another point where common assumptions begin to shift. The life of extreme wealth is often imagined as idle, but in practice it was full of obligations. These obligations were not always written down, yet they were deeply felt. To decline too many invitations risked fading from view. To attend without care risked appearing careless. To support the wrong cause or associate too closely with the wrong circle could create subtle but lasting misalignments. The wealthy were, in a sense, curators of their own visibility, constantly adjusting what was seen and what was withheld. Clubs played a role that is sometimes underestimated today. Private clubs in Manhattan were not simply places of leisure. They were controlled environments where the rules of entry preserved a particular social texture. Membership lists were carefully managed, often reflecting decades of accumulated relationships. Inside, the atmosphere could feel almost suspended in time. Upholstery, lighting, and even the cadence of conversation seemed designed to resist the pace of the city outside. Within these spaces, introductions carried weight. Being brought into a conversation by an established member could function as a kind of endorsement. Being left on the periphery could signal the opposite. The clubs allowed wealth to slow down, to reassert a more traditional form of hierarchy that did not rely entirely on recent financial success. In a decade where money was increasingly fluid and visible, these rooms provided continuity. They reminded their members that not all forms of capital were equally negotiable. Meanwhile, outside these carefully controlled interiors, the broader city continued to shift. The 1990s saw neighborhoods change at different speeds, with some areas rapidly becoming more desirable and others still carrying reputations from earlier decades. For the very rich, this created both opportunity and caution. Investing in property could be enormously profitable, but choosing the wrong location could also mark one as out of step with emerging patterns of desirability. Real estate, in this sense, was never neutral. It was a language. To own in certain buildings signaled permanence and acceptance. To buy in a newly fashionable area suggested foresight, or sometimes risk-taking. Developers began to recognize that luxury itself could be redesigned. Buildings were constructed with amenities that went beyond traditional expectations. Concierge services, private gyms, more advanced security, and layouts that prioritized privacy over formality. These changes reflected a subtle shift in what the wealthy wanted. Not just status, but control over their immediate environment. And still, even with all these layers of insulation and design, the city had a way of reminding its wealthiest residents that they were not entirely separate from it. Traffic could still disrupt carefully planned schedules. Weather could still alter the tone of an event. A headline could still intrude on a private afternoon. The 1990s were not free from scandal or financial uncertainty, and when those moments arrived, they moved quickly through the same social networks that had once seemed so stable. Evening approached with its own set of expectations. This was when the performance of wealth became more visible again, but also more formalized. Dressing for dinner or an event was not simply about choosing clothing. It involved an awareness of who would be present, what kind of occasion it was, and what tone was expected. A charity gala required a different kind of presentation than a private dinner, and both differed from a more casual gathering among close friends. The preparation itself could be elaborate. Stylists, hairdressers, and assistants might all contribute to the final appearance. Jewelry was selected not only for beauty but for appropriateness. Too understated and one risked seeming disengaged. Too extravagant and one risked appearing unaware of the room. The balance was delicate, and those who mastered it seemed to move effortlessly through spaces that could quietly judge every detail. Arrivals at evening events often revealed the underlying choreography of the city's elite. Cars pulled up in a steady rhythm, drivers stepping out with practiced efficiency. Guests entered through doors that separated them, briefly, from the street's unpredictability. Inside, lighting softened edges, music filled gaps in conversation, and the atmosphere was carefully controlled to create a sense of continuity, as if this gathering were simply an extension of many others that had come before. And yet, beneath the surface, each event also carried its own subtle tensions. Who had been invited and who had not? Who arrived together and who arrived alone? Who seemed comfortable and who seemed to be adjusting, watching, learning? These details were rarely spoken aloud, but they were observed. In a world where reputation mattered so deeply, observation itself became a form of quiet currency. It is here, in these evening rooms, that one of the more revealing contradictions of wealthy life in 1990s New York begins to emerge more clearly. Surrounded by people, conversation, and carefully arranged beauty, many individuals were still navigating a kind of isolation that came not from lack of contact, but from the constant need to maintain a version of themselves that fit the expectations of the room. And as these nights unfolded, through speeches, dinners, and long conversations that stretched well past midnight, the line between genuine connection and social necessity could become increasingly difficult to distinguish, setting the stage for a deeper look at what these relationships actually offered and what they quietly demanded in return. That difficulty, in telling genuine connection from social necessity, shaped far more of elite life than the polished photographs ever suggested. In 1990s New York, friendship among the very rich was rarely free of context. People did, of course, form real attachments, long marriages, enduring alliances, and circles of deep familiarity. But those relationships existed inside a city where access itself had value, and where almost every dinner table carried some mixture of affection, utility, memory, and calculation. A private dinner on the Upper East Side might look intimate from the outside. The candles were low, the flowers arranged with studied looseness, the silver polished but not ostentatious. There might be 10 guests, perhaps 12, seated in a dining room large enough to keep everyone at an agreeable distance. The host and hostess would have thought carefully about the composition of the evening. Not too many people from one field, not too much rivalry, one or two names strong enough to raise the room's importance. Someone amusing but not too erratic. Someone newly interesting. Someone old enough to give the night a sense of continuity. This was social life as curation, and it could be astonishingly subtle. A guest list was not simply a list of friends. It was an arrangement of energies, histories, and possible futures. A financier might be placed next to a museum trustee whose board could be useful to espouse. A magazine editor might sit near a philanthropist whose foundation was quietly reshaping a cultural institution. A divorced woman re-entering society after a difficult year might be included not merely out of kindness, but because her reappearance required witnesses. To be invited was flattering, but it also meant one was being placed, read, and woven into a certain pattern. The food itself, although luxurious by ordinary standards, was not always the true center of these evenings. By the 1990s, many of the wealthiest households relied on chefs, caterers, or highly trained domestic staff who understood how to produce meals that felt abundant without seeming heavy, elegant without appearing to strain. The point was rarely to astonish guests with invention. In many of these rooms, novelty was less admired than confidence. The meal should feel inevitable, as though it had simply emerged in its proper form. Such ease, of course, was expensive. But what made these evenings revealing was not just their refinement. It was the way they exposed the emotional architecture of wealthy life. Conversation moved in layers. At the surface there might be theater openings, school admissions, travel, politics, real estate, books, or the latest trouble at a nonprofit board. Slightly beneath that came the truly important material. Who was in difficulty, who was overextended, who had separated from whom, whose son was unreliable, whose daughter had done unexpectedly well, which magazine had shifted editor, which banker was suddenly avoiding eye contact, which property was quietly being sold. This was information, but it was also reassurance. A rich social world can seem glamorous because it appears crowded, yet crowding does not remove loneliness. In some cases it sharpens it. Many people in these circles lived with a constant, if rarely confessed, uncertainty about whether they were loved for themselves, valued for their position, or merely tolerated because of the worlds they connected. The richer the environment, the harder sincerity could sometimes be to measure. That was especially true in a city where everyone seemed to know someone who knew someone else. Children growing up in this world absorbed these tensions long before they could articulate them. Their lives, too, were managed with extraordinary care. Private schools in Manhattan were not simply educational institutions. They were mechanisms of reproduction. They taught children to read, write, calculate, and analyze, certainly, but they also taught them how to inhabit a particular kind of confidence. The school itself mattered, the family names on the directories mattered, the parents on the boards mattered, and the friendships made there could shape adult life decades later. For wealthy parents, school choice was therefore loaded with meaning. A child's admission was not just a practical success, but a confirmation that the family belonged within a particular civic and social story. Tutors were hired, consultants quietly consulted, interviews prepared for, and disappointments managed with the language of chance even when they felt like verdicts. It is one of the stranger features of extreme privilege that even after securing nearly every material advantage, parents could still experience profound anxiety over institutions that remained selective enough to say no. The daily life of these children could be deeply comfortable and strangely compressed at once. They had drivers, nannies, beautifully organized bedrooms, summer plans, winter trips, music lessons, orthodontists on call, and wardrobes managed with quiet efficiency. Yet many also lived inside schedules designed not merely for development, but for continuity. Achievement was expected, but not just any achievement. It had to align with family style. One child could be eccentric if the eccentricity came wrapped in talent and the right school. Another could be artistic if the art remained legible to cultivated adults. Freedom existed, but often within elegant boundaries. Teenagers, especially, occupied an uneasy place in this world. They were rich enough to be insulated from many ordinary consequences and watched closely enough to feel that insulation as pressure. Manhattan in the 1990s offered temptations in abundance: nightlife, fashion, substances, the thrill of moving through adult spaces before one had earned the emotional equipment for them. Families knew this. Schools knew it. Staff often knew it before anyone else. The result was a culture of controlled permissiveness in some households, stricter restraint in others, and beneath both, a steady current of concern about embarrassment. What appears from the outside as youthful glamour was often underwritten by quiet surveillance. Drivers reported back. Doormen noticed who came and went. Housekeepers saw the state of bedrooms in the morning. Assistants sometimes knew more than parents did. The wealthy could purchase privacy from the public, but within their own domestic systems privacy was often thin. This is another irony worth lingering on. To live among staff was to live supported but also observed. The apartment that shielded a family from the city could become, in difficult moments, a chamber of too many witnesses. Marriage, too, took on its own distinctive shape under these conditions. Wealth could soften marital strain by distributing burdens outward: childcare, travel arrangements, domestic management, social planning, but it could also conceal problems long enough for them to become structural. A couple might seem effortlessly compatible in public because every rough edge had been professionally managed. The home looked beautiful. The dinners ran on time. The children were presentable. Vacations were correctly scheduled. Yet emotional distance could persist behind all of it, and sometimes because of it. For women in particular, the 1990s brought an awkward intersection of old expectations and newer freedoms. Some elite women had substantial professional lives of their own in publishing, philanthropy, fashion, law, media, or business. Others remained more traditionally positioned as hostesses, mothers, social organizers, or custodians of family image. Many occupied some combination of these roles. But even in households that presented themselves as modern, the burden of aesthetic and social coherence still fell heavily on women. They were often expected to make wealth look humane. The house welcoming, the children stable, the table attractive, the calendar charitable, the family legible. That expectation could be exhausting precisely because it was so often framed as natural. A beautifully run home was treated as an extension of feminine grace rather than the outcome of labor, management, and near-constant vigilance. To host successfully, dress well, remember obligations, maintain friendships, guide children, and appear untroubled required not just resources but skill. Yet, because wealth surrounded the process, the skill itself was easy to underestimate. The result was a form of social work that was both privileged and demanding, admired in public and often emotionally expensive in private. Men were not free from their own performance burdens. A wealthy husband in 1990s New York was expected to project steadiness even when the underlying financial world was becoming increasingly abstract, volatile, and competitive. The outward signs of success remained old-fashioned enough: tailored suits, private offices, club memberships, proper addresses, but the engines generating that success were changing. Deals moved faster. Capital traveled more fluidly. Media attention sharpened. Reputation could still be built over decades, but it could also be damaged with alarming speed. This matters because one of the period's most important changes was the growing influence of finance not just on wealth itself, but on the emotional style of wealth. Earlier elite New York had often valued continuity, inheritance, and the appearance of settled confidence. The 1990s did not abandon those values, but they were increasingly animated by money that moved more quickly and by careers tied to more aggressive forms of risk. This altered dinner conversations, real estate choices, philanthropy, art collecting, and even marriage markets. The old world did not disappear. It began learning how to absorb the new one without admitting that it needed to adapt. You could see that adaptation in the cultural life of the city as well. Art collecting, for instance, was not only a matter of private taste. It was part of how wealth explained itself to itself. To collect the right art, support the right museum, underwrite the right exhibition, or sit on the right board was to signal that one's money had become civilized. Yet here too there were differences between older and newer fortunes. Some bought quietly and with patient advice. Others bought conspicuously, turning culture into another theater of status. Both approaches could end in beautiful rooms. Only one was guaranteed admiration. The same was true of charity. Philanthropy in elite New York was sincere in many cases, and often materially important. Hospitals, museums, schools, and social services depended on major donors. But giving also carried social grammar. One did not merely give. One gave in ways that announced seriousness, placement, and style. A gala table, a committee chairmanship, a family name on a wall, a pledge made at the right moment in front of the right audience. These could all enlarge prestige while also supporting institutions that genuinely mattered. To modern eyes, this can look cynical. In practice, it was often both principled and strategic at once. That doubleness is one of the safest guides through this world. Almost nothing was entirely one thing. A gala was a charitable event and a ranking mechanism. A school was a place of education and a gatekeeping network. A club was a leisure space and a sorting machine. A dinner was hospitality and reconnaissance. A marriage was intimacy and alliance. An apartment was comfort and public statement. Once seen this way, elite New York becomes less like a fantasy kingdom and more like a system of interlocking pressures wrapped in very expensive fabric. And of course, not everyone at the top felt equally secure inside that system. Some fortunes were deep enough to survive poor decisions, bad press, and long periods of disorder. Others were more fragile than their surface suggested. A couple might live magnificently while carrying debts that made every event a little more necessary, every connection a little more valuable, every rumor a little more dangerous. The city was full of people skilled at appearing stronger than they were. In this respect, the rich were not unlike everyone else. They were simply doing it with better lighting. The tabloid culture of New York sharpened all of this. By the 1990s, the city had a well-developed appetite for public embarrassment, and wealth made a tempting target. Gossip columns, society pages, and newspapers fed on the friction between privilege and disgrace. Affairs, divorces, custody fights, tax troubles, social exclusions, and vulgar displays of ambition could all become public entertainment. The very people most committed to privacy were often those whose mistakes drew the most curiosity. This created a strange environment in which public visibility remained essential, even as exposure itself felt increasingly dangerous. So discretion became a higher art. Lawyers handled crises before friends were fully informed. Publicists softened narratives. Social allies signaled support through attendance, seating, or silence. Entire evenings could pass with everyone in the room aware of a scandal and no one naming it directly. The discipline required for this was considerable. Rich New Yorkers were not merely avoiding shame. They were preserving the appearance that their world remained governed by composure, even when it plainly was not. Night, by this point, could stretch late. After a gala there might be a smaller supper somewhere more private, or drinks in a quiet apartment where shoes came off, jackets loosened, and the room relaxed enough for more honest sentences to emerge. These moments, paradoxically, may have been among the most human in elite life. Once the larger audience was gone, people could allow a little weariness to show. A woman might admit she was tired of being seen. A man might confess fear about business he would never mention at a banquet table. A hostess might finally sit down in her own drawing room and look, for a brief minute, less like a symbol than a person. Still, even these softer moments existed within limits. Morning would come, the papers would arrive, and the city's machinery would begin again. Apartments would need tending. Calls would need returning. Drivers would be downstairs. Children would be moved through their routines. Offices would reopen. Hair appointments, board meetings, fittings, school functions, lunches, and dinners would once again assemble the day into something elegant enough to pass as effortless. And it is when that polished cycle begins to repeat, day after day, season after season, that another, quieter truth starts to come into view. The richest New Yorkers were not simply living in the city. They were moving through a calendar of migration within privilege itself, with Manhattan only one station in a larger annual pattern of country houses, Hampton's weekends, holiday circuits, and strategic disappearances that shaped how wealth was experienced, displayed, and protected from one month to the next. That larger annual pattern gave wealthy life in 1990s New York one of its most important rhythms. Manhattan was the center, but it was rarely the whole stage. The richest families did not simply remain in the city and occasionally travel for pleasure. They circulated through a set of expected locations that together formed a geography of privilege. The Hamptons in summer, country houses in Connecticut or Westchester, Palm Beach in winter for some, Aspen for others, Europe when the calendar and confidence allowed it. To understand what life was really like, one has to see that wealth was not only about where one lived, but about where one could disappear to without seeming to disappear at all. The Hamptons were perhaps the clearest example. By the 1990s, they had become not merely a seasonal retreat, but an extension of elite New York itself, a place where the city's hierarchies loosened slightly in form while remaining fully active underneath. Houses there could be immense, but they were expected to suggest leisure rather than effort. A host might present a weekend as casual, though an army of preparation had gone into making it appear so. Deliveries arrived before guests. Flowers were placed. Bedrooms were made ready. Beach towels were folded. Outdoor lunches were organized to look almost improvised. A great deal of money was spent to preserve the illusion that no one was trying too hard. That illusion mattered. In Manhattan, wealth could be formal. In the Hamptons, it was supposed to breathe. White upholstery, weathered shingles, long tables, hedges, lawns, and tennis courts all helped create a style of privilege that seemed less armored than Park Avenue and more open to sun and sea. But this openness was selective. Who was invited for a weekend mattered. Who had the better house mattered. Which part of the Hamptons one occupied mattered. Old local distinctions remained powerful, even if outsiders often collapsed the whole region into a single fantasy of beach wealth. There was also a revealing difference between owning and merely visiting. A guest could enjoy the weekend. An owner belonged to the circuit. That belonging changed the season. One was no longer just escaping New York, but re-establishing New York's social pattern in a setting where everyone pretended to be freer. Friday afternoons became migrations of drivers, children, garment bags, coolers, and dogs. Staff often moved before or after the family, setting up houses that might sit quiet through the week and become the center of intense social activity by Saturday evening. The houses themselves told stories. Some were inherited or held for many years, and with them came the confidence of permanence. Others were newly built or aggressively renovated, reflecting 1990s tastes for scale, amenities, and impact. Here again, the difference between old and new money could be felt, though not always stated. A house that looked too polished, too large, or too intent on impressing could provoke exactly the kind of attention it sought to avoid. The preferred style of display in certain circles remained expensive understatement, though understatement in this world might still mean a property larger than a boutique hotel and grounds maintained to near theatrical perfection. Weekends there were not empty. They followed a recognizable sequence of movement and appearance. There were tennis matches, beach walks, cocktails, dinners, charity events, house visits, and the quiet but constant traffic of comparison. Who had bought where? Who had renovated badly? Who had separated but continued hosting as though nothing had changed? Which teenagers were becoming difficult? Which financier was suddenly being watched more carefully? Which woman seemed tired? And which one had returned from some restorative clinic or private retreat with a newly composed expression? The Hamptons, for all their beauty, could be unforgiving. They offered relaxation, certainly, but also a concentrated version of social visibility. In Manhattan, a person could disappear into buildings, offices, and layered schedules. Out east, especially within the core circuits of the wealthy, one could be seen more continuously. A weekend became a test of household management, hospitality, and mood. Guests noticed everything. The quality of the linens, the ease of the staff, the food, the condition of the garden, whether children were noisy, whether the hosts seemed genuinely at ease with each other. A single awkward dinner could echo much longer than it deserved. This is one reason why the rich often seem to be resting while in fact performing another form of labor. Even leisure had standards. To spend the summer well required judgment. One had to know when to host, when to attend, when to stay quiet, and when to be seen. The same charity and institutional life that structured Manhattan extended outward into seasonal events. A benefit in the Hamptons was not just a pleasant gathering under a tent. It was a reaffirmation that the social map remained intact even at the edge of the beach. Children experienced this seasonal shift differently. For them, the Hamptons could feel like liberation from the tighter choreography of the city. There was more space, more physical freedom, more time with other children from similar families, and a sense that adults were momentarily less focused. But that freedom existed inside yet another protected environment. The children were watched by nannies, older siblings, family friends, staff, and the broad network of adults who knew whose child belonged to whom. Summer romances, small rebellions, parties, and accidents all unfolded within a setting that felt looser than Manhattan, but remained heavily structured by class and recognition. Teenagers especially encountered a different version of privilege there. Cars, boats, beach parties, and large houses created opportunities for risk that were difficult to contain fully. Parents could manage, but not completely control, the social lives of young people whose summers revolved around a dense and often repetitive set of faces. What looked idyllic from a distance could become claustrophobic at close range. Everyone knew everyone, or at least knew enough. A minor indiscretion in an ordinary town might disappear. In elite summer circles, it could become lore by Sunday afternoon. And still, people returned every year. Partly because these places were beautiful, but also because the repetition itself was meaningful. To summer in the right place with the right continuity signaled that one's life had structure beyond mere consumption. It suggested rootedness, tradition, and membership. Even relatively new money understood the advantage of that signal. A family that had once been defined mainly by professional success could, over time, naturalize itself through routine. Same summer area, same school network, same benefits, same broad social universe. Season by season, new wealth could begin to look established. The country house served a related but slightly different role. Outside the city and outside the summer spectacle, homes in Connecticut, Westchester, or the Hudson Valley offered a version of retreat that carried fewer theatrical expectations. These places could be used for weekends that were quieter, more family-centered, or intentionally less exposed. The grounds mattered, but in a different register. A long driveway, old trees, perhaps horses, perhaps a pool, perhaps a garden that suggested cultivation rather than fashion. If the Hamptons often displayed wealth socially, the country house could display it morally, as stability, continuity, and domestic seriousness. This distinction was useful for families who wanted more than one image available to them. They could be elegant in Manhattan, relaxed in the Hamptons, and grounded in the country. Each setting softened the others. A financier who seemed too sharp in the city might look reassuringly traditional at a country property with old books, dogs, and children running across the lawn. A family whose Manhattan apartment felt almost museum-like could appear warmer in the country, surrounded by mudrooms, bicycles, and the carefully managed untidiness that only wealth can afford to romanticize. There is a small but telling irony in that. The rich often cultivated settings that appeared simpler than their city lives, but the simplicity itself was resource-intensive. To maintain a country estate required caretakers, gardeners, repairs, seasonal transitions, insurance, and endless attention. A lawn did not remain ideal by accident. An old house did not continue to feel old in the pleasing sense without constant intervention. Wealth in the 1990s often expressed itself not through raw novelty, but through the ability to hold complexity together invisibly in multiple places at once. This multi-household life also altered marriage and family dynamics. A second or third home could provide relief from city pressures, but it could also expose tensions. In a large Manhattan apartment, a strained couple might avoid each other by schedule alone. In the country, under the slower rhythm of a weekend or holiday, silences could lengthen. The same was true across generations. Grandparents, adult children, in-laws, nannies, and guests all entered these houses in shifting combinations, and the emotional weather could change with each arrival. The architecture of wealth created room, but room did not guarantee ease. The annual winter migration for some families added another layer. Palm Beach, in particular, offered a climate and a social world that felt familiar enough not to threaten established identity. It was warm, ceremonial, conservative in certain stylistic ways, and full of overlapping networks from New York. For older wealth especially, it provided continuity. A person could leave Manhattan's dark winter and enter another enclave where familiar names, clubs, and rituals resumed under brighter skies. The geography changed, but the social vocabulary did not. Aspen, by contrast, could carry slightly different meanings. Ski culture, mountain property, and winter sport introduced a more visibly active style of luxury. The right house there, the right holiday guest list, the right photographs from the slopes or from a terrace at dusk. All communicated youth, vitality, and cosmopolitan reach. The 1990s elite were increasingly capable of moving between these worlds with practiced ease. Their annual calendars mapped not just wealth, but variation within wealth. Old Atlantic formality, Western recreation, European polish, Manhattan intensity. Travel abroad functioned similarly. To spend time in London, Paris, Tuscany, the south of France, or certain carefully chosen resorts was never simply a matter of seeing the world. It was also a way of teaching children, entertaining peers, broadening one's cultural capital, and reinforcing the idea that private life deserved beautiful settings. Yet even here, the wealthy rarely traveled quite as freely as fantasy suggests. Many went to the same places in the same seasons among the same kinds of people. Familiarity was part of the luxury. The point was not unpredictability. It was movement without uncertainty. That preference helps explain something central about the rich in 1990s New York. They valued access but also management. They wanted many options, yet within environments already filtered for safety, taste, and recognition. They could in principle go anywhere. In practice, they often chose places where the staff was discreet, the standards known, the company legible, and the risk of social friction low. This made their lives comfortable, but it also narrowed them. A world full of possibilities can still become repetitive if one keeps selecting from the same polished menu. The city remained the anchor because it was where careers, institutions, and reputations were most actively maintained. But these seasonal exits mattered because they reveal that elite life was not a single glamorous condition. It was a cycle of settings, each one performing a slightly different function in preserving the whole. Manhattan was where status was most densely tested. The Hamptons were where it was displayed in leisure. The country house restored the image of family solidity. Winter circuits maintained health, sociability, and continuity. Europe supplied culture and refinement. Together they made wealth feel less like spending and more like an atmosphere one moved through all year. Of course, this atmosphere depended on time as much as money. The flexibility to leave the city on Thursday afternoon, to remain away for weeks in summer, or to organize an entire household around seasonal migration was itself a form of power. It separated the very rich not only from the poor, but from many merely affluent professionals whose work tied them more tightly to offices and fixed calendars. Even in a prosperous decade, there were levels within comfort, and time was among the clearest markers of which level one had reached. Yet the possession of time did not necessarily produce tranquility. In some cases it produced more opportunities to compare, curate, and worry. If every season had its correct version, then every season also carried the possibility of getting it wrong. The summer house might not be large enough. The winter plan might feel stale. The children might resist the expected rituals. A spouse might prefer one circuit over another. Friends might drift toward more fashionable destinations. New money might arrive with more confidence than good taste and still, annoyingly, attract attention. The privileged calendar brought with it a privileged form of instability. It is useful to pause here, because this is where the image of the filthy rich becomes more complicated in a way that feels truer than either envy or condemnation alone. Yes, these lives were extraordinarily protected. Yes, they contained levels of comfort, beauty, and convenience that most New Yorkers would never touch. But they were also lives lived inside a constant choreography of place, expectation, and social interpretation. The freedom was real, though never quite as loose as it looked. The luxury was real, though almost always maintained through hidden work and hidden judgment. And once we begin to see wealth as a system of movement, management, and carefully staged environments, another question naturally follows. What did all this abundance actually feel like at the level of the body, of food, fitness, aging, medicine, beauty, sleep, and the quiet fear of decline? Because by the 1990s, the richest New Yorkers were not simply buying houses and dinners. They were increasingly investing in a more intimate project, the management of the self, as the culture of wellness, cosmetic maintenance, private medicine, and age-defying discipline began to reshape what elite life demanded from those who wanted not just to remain wealthy, but to continue looking as though wealth agreed with them. That management of the self became one of the quieter obsessions of wealthy New York in the 1990s. Money had long purchased comfort, discretion, and the soft removal of inconvenience, but by the end of the 20th century it was increasingly expected to purchase something more intimate as well. A body that seemed disciplined, preserved, and almost improbably untouched by ordinary wear. If the apartment, the driver, the school, and the summer house announced status from the outside, the face, skin, posture, and general vitality of the wealthy began to announce something even more demanding. They were meant to suggest that privilege had entered the bloodstream. This did not mean that everyone at the top looked the same. Far from it. Old New York still retained a certain tolerance for the elegantly weathered face, the handsome signs of age, the woman whose authority came less from striving youthfulness than from composure, tailoring, and command of a room. But the 1990s were also a decade in which cosmetic medicine, private fitness culture, nutritional discipline, and anti-aging anxieties began to gather into a more visible whole. One could still age naturally, in theory. In practice, the pressure not to do so too plainly was growing. Women felt that pressure first and most intensely, though men were not untouched by it. In the upper ranks of Manhattan life, appearance had never been incidental. Clothing, grooming, and bearing had always formed part of one's social language. But by the 1990s, the expectation was no longer simply that one be well turned out. One was increasingly expected to look maintained. Not young exactly, because obvious chasing after youth could itself look desperate, but rested, controlled, smooth enough to suggest care, and expensive enough to suggest the best kind of care. That produced its own daily routine, and like so much else in wealthy life, the routine was designed to seem lighter than it truly was. A woman might have a dermatologist whose office did not advertise widely, a facialist whose name circulated quietly in the right circles, a hair colorist booked weeks in advance, a trusted manicurist willing to come privately, a nutritionist who spoke in the language of wellness rather than deprivation, and a trainer whose work had to show results without leaving the body looking obviously labored. The goal was not transformation in the theatrical sense. It was continuous adjustment. Nothing should look done all at once. Everything should look as if it had simply held together unusually well. Here again, the rich were purchasing something subtler than luxury. They were buying plausible naturalness. This was expensive not only because of the quality of the services, but because of the frequency and discretion involved. The most successful cosmetic upkeep in elite New York was often the kind no one openly acknowledged. A face looked fresher. A jawline somehow remained firm. The body seemed lean but not punishingly so. Friends might notice, but the vocabulary around it remained careful. Open vanity, especially in older and more established circles, could still offend. Men inhabited a parallel but slightly different version of this world. A wealthy man in 1990s New York was less likely to be judged for every contour of his face, but he was increasingly judged for signals of neglect. Extra weight, visible exhaustion, bad skin, poor posture, and clothing that no longer sat properly could all imply deeper disorder. In finance, law, media, and real estate, the successful male body was meant to communicate stamina and command. A man did not need to be beautiful. He needed to appear durable. The right barber, the right shirts, the right gym, the right physician, and increasingly the right diet all formed part of that impression. Fitness itself changed meaning during this period. Exercise had once been, for many wealthy urban adults, a secondary matter or something handled through tennis, squash, golf, skiing, or occasional private effort. By the 1990s, structured fitness became more central to elite identity. Private trainers grew more important. Exclusive health clubs and high-end gyms offered not just equipment, but privacy and social reassurance. Working out was no longer solely about recreation. It became one more sign that a person was governing the self correctly. This had a deeper cultural logic. The rich already possessed servants, drivers, staff, and every kind of material assistance. That meant the body itself became one of the few remaining places where virtue could still be publicly demonstrated. To be lean, energetic, and visibly well suggested discipline in a life otherwise cushioned by indulgence. The irony, of course, was that such discipline was often made possible by money. Time for training, private instruction, meal planning, home equipment, medical oversight, and freedom from the work schedules that exhausted so many other people. The self-controlled elite body looked moral, but it was also heavily subsidized. Food reflected this contradiction perfectly. Wealthy New Yorkers in the 1990s had access to astonishing meals, elite restaurants, private chefs, imported ingredients, and all the old luxuries of dining out. Yet many also lived within a constant background hum of dietary management. Lunch might be elegant but deliberately light. Dinners were rich, but portions at home could be controlled. The rise of wellness culture introduced new languages of restraint. Low-fat phases, careful protein, mineral water, individualized plans, nutritional consultations, cleans in softer early forms, and a general suspicion of any appetite that seemed too innocent of consequences. This made elite eating in the 1990s strangely double. Publicly, one still attended dinners, hosted beautifully, and participated in the city's restaurant culture. Privately, one might be forever calculating. Some women of means knew exactly how little they could eat before a gala dress fit as intended. Some men balanced restaurant indulgence with punishingly virtuous breakfasts and private exercise. Others oscillated, eating richly in public and correcting in private, which is a pattern not unique to the wealthy, though privilege gave it better concealment. And there was concealment everywhere. The bathroom cabinets of elite Manhattan apartments contained not only perfumes and imported soaps, but prescription creams, discreet medications, beauty tools, travel-sized routines, and all the ordinary anxieties of the body arranged in expensive containers. A woman dressing for dinner might appear entirely composed by the time she entered the elevator, but the composition often rested on a private infrastructure of remedies, schedules, appointments, and small acts of vigilance. To age attractively in this environment was not a passive process. It was project management. The same was true of medicine. One of the most powerful but least visible privileges of great wealth in 1990s New York was access to private medical care of exceptional responsiveness. The wealthy did not simply have doctors. They had networks. Internists who took late calls, specialists reached through personal recommendation, hospital rooms handled with more privacy, appointments accelerated, second opinions arranged quietly and quickly. A family with means could navigate illness very differently from an ordinary New Yorker. Delays were shortened. Uncertainty, if not removed, was at least managed by speed and proximity. This mattered not only in times of serious illness, but in the constant maintenance of reassurance. The rich could test earlier, consult more often, screen more thoroughly, and worry with better support. Yet this did not always produce calm. In some cases, it produced the opposite. The more medicine became available as a resource, the more the body could feel like a site of endless monitoring. A symptom did not need to be endured and forgotten, could be examined. A change in sleep, digestion, mood, or skin could activate a chain of consultations. Privilege made preventive care possible, but it also made low-grade anxiety harder to dismiss. Nowhere was this more emotionally charged than around aging. The very rich in New York were surrounded by visual reminders of succession. Younger women entered the social world every season. Younger men arrived with new fortunes, newer apartments, and the confidence of those not yet touched by public failure. Fashion shifted. Media attention shifted. Beauty standards shifted. In such a city, age was not simply biological. It was comparative. One could feel older not because one had become old in any absolute sense, but because the room had changed around them. For women especially, this could become cruelly precise. A woman in her 50s or 60s, even one of immense social skill and security, might feel pressure from every direction at once. To remain thin, to remain visible, to remain gracious, to remain relevant, and to do all of this without ever appearing to compete openly with youth. That is an impossible assignment, though many performed it magnificently for years. Their elegance, however, should not be mistaken for ease. Often it represented long experience in navigating a culture that admired women and judged them with equal intensity. Some responded by mastering the available tools. Others leaned more heavily into authority, philanthropy, hosting, collecting, family leadership, and the social power that outlasted beauty's most volatile metrics. In this sense, elite women were not merely victims of the system. Many were among its most intelligent operators. They understood exactly how rooms worked, how reputations moved, how younger women were introduced, how institutions could be shaped, and how one's role could evolve without disappearing. But adaptation still required energy, and energy itself had become part of the body project. Sleep, too, played an unexpectedly revealing part in all this. Wealth promised rest, but rest did not always follow. Large, quiet apartments can contain their own forms of wakefulness. Rich people worried about their children, their marriages, their money, their health, their standing, their inheritances, their image, their loneliness, and the possibility that the life they had built depended on more fragile arrangements than they cared to admit. Some used physicians to manage sleep. Some drank more than they should. Some relied on routines that resembled private rituals of self-soothing. The city outside might finally be quiet, but the mind did not always obey the architecture. In this respect, the body became one of the few places where the fantasy of complete control most obviously broke down. Staff could smooth the home. Drivers could smooth the city. Bankers could smooth money. Lawyers could smooth scandal. Publicists could smooth narrative. But the body remained stubbornly alive, susceptible to exhaustion, vanity, illness, desire, panic, appetite, and decline. The richer one became, the more tempting it was to believe that enough care, enough expertise, enough discipline might finally persuade the body to behave like the rest of one's managed world. It rarely did. The decade's wellness culture exploited that hope in soft, intelligent ways. It did not usually promise immortality outright. Promised optimization, better skin, more energy, clearer mind, a body that looked less burdened by time, a face that still resembled itself only slightly improved, better balance, better digestion, better circulation, better posture, better recovery. All of this was presented in tones of health rather than vanity, which made it more socially acceptable and, in some circles, more compelling. To spend money on beauty could seem frivolous. To spend money on wellness could seem wise, even when the line between the two was almost invisible. This blending of health and appearance also shaped domestic space. Bathrooms grew more luxurious, closer in feeling to private spas. Home gyms and exercise rooms became more common in larger apartments and houses. Kitchens reflected newer dietary concerns, with lower-fat cooking, carefully sourced ingredients, and a growing awareness that food could be classified not just by pleasure but by bodily effect. Even travel incorporated self-maintenance. A trip was not simply a trip. It might include a private fitness schedule, a favored therapist, a trusted masseuse at a hotel, or a doctor's number in case something felt off. The very rich were therefore living through a subtle shift in what prosperity looked like. The earlier image of wealth as visible abundance, silver, servants, wine cellars, fur, jewels, grand rooms, did not disappear, but it was being joined by another image. Controlled bodies, careful consumption, discreet procedures, and an almost clinical attention to preserving one's edge. Luxury had moved inward. It no longer only furnished the drawing room. It reorganized the skin, the diet, the sleep schedule, the annual checkup, the posture in a photograph, the hidden effort required to arrive looking unchanged. There is a sadness in that, though not a simple one. After all, people of every class worry about aging and health. The wealthy did not invent those fears. What they had, unusually, was the means to build entire systems around them. They could answer anxiety with appointments, experts, environments, and products. Yet, because the answers were so abundant, the fear could remain permanently active, never forced into the silence that ordinary limitation sometimes imposes. One more specialist, one more regimen, one more intervention so minor that it scarcely counted. One more reason to believe the self could still be improved. And still, bodies carried history. A hard-drinking social life showed itself. Stress showed itself. Grief showed itself. So did boredom, resentment, overwork, and the subtle flattening that can come from living too long in rooms where one is always expected to be composed. The face that entered an evening event was not just a face. It was a record, though often partially edited, of years spent managing both privilege and the expectations attached to it. If this part of wealthy life sounds especially inward, that is because by the 1990s the private management of the body had become inseparable from the public management of status. One supported the other. To look healthy was to look capable. To look fresh was to look solvent, protected, and in command. To let oneself go too visibly risked suggesting not only age, but collapse in some wider sense. The body, in elite New York, had become another address at which reputation lived. And from there, it is only a short step to another question that mattered just as much, especially once wealth had children and grandchildren waiting behind it. If the body could be trained, preserved, and publicly presented, so too could legacy. The richest New Yorkers were not only maintaining themselves in the 1990s, they were also trying, sometimes gracefully and sometimes anxiously, to convert private fortune into continuity. Through schools, inheritances, foundations, marriages, names, apartments, art, and the long, delicate task of making sure that money did not simply exist, but lasted in a form the family could still recognize. That long, delicate task of making money last in a recognizable form was one of the deepest preoccupations of wealthy New York in the 1990s, even when it was spoken about only indirectly. Fortune, after all, was not the same thing as continuity. A person could make a great deal of money in a few good years. A family could own astonishing property, entertain beautifully, educate its children well, and still discover, a generation later, that very little of its world had held together. The rich knew this. Some had watched older names diminish. Some had inherited stories of fortune splintered by bad marriages, weak heirs, taxes, vanity, lawsuits, addiction, or simply the slow erosion that comes when one generation spends more fluently than the next can replenish. So behind the public elegance of elite life there was often a quieter, more serious discipline, the management of legacy. This did not always look dramatic. It was embedded in conversations with lawyers, in trust structures, in board appointments, in the careful disposition of apartments and houses, in the art that would remain in the family and the art that might not, in the schools children attended, in whom they married, in how they were taught to behave around money, and in the tone parents used when trying to pass on not just assets but a method of living with them. This is where the world of the very rich becomes especially interesting, because inheritance is never only financial. What families feared losing was rarely just cash. It was texture, the apartment with the right address, the summer house with enough history to feel rooted, the silver that came out for certain dinners, the family foundation that attached a surname to civic seriousness, the school network, the private club membership, the broad assumption by others and eventually by one's own children that this life was not an accident but a proper and ongoing condition. Yet the 1990s were not an easy decade in which to preserve that illusion. Markets created extraordinary new fortunes, but they also emphasized speed. New wealth arrived faster, displayed itself more openly, and often seemed less interested in imitating the full moral style of older elites. That created pressure on established families. Some adapted elegantly, absorbing the new era while keeping their tone. Others felt, perhaps without saying so, that the world had become noisier and less governed by the codes that once protected them. Legacy, under such conditions, was no longer just about conserving what existed. It was about deciding how much change a family identity could absorb before it stopped feeling like itself. Children stood at the center of this anxiety. Wealthy parents in Manhattan spent vast sums on education, but the true object of that spending was not simply academic achievement. It was transmission. A child needed credentials, yes, but also judgment. They needed to learn how to move through expensive rooms without appearing dazzled, how to speak without too much strain, how to recognize when generosity was expected, how to understand that staff deserved a certain kind of treatment, and how to avoid the particular vulgarities that could make a fortune look new, insecure, or unstable. This could produce highly polished young adults. It could also produce a certain emptiness if the forms were learned without any deeper inner shape. One of the recurring fears among older wealthy parents was that their children might understand privilege as consumption rather than inheritance in the broader, more demanding sense. To inherit well, in elite terms, meant to preserve standards, not merely enjoy resources. It required one to marry suitably or at least intelligibly, not embarrass the family in public, maintain relationships with institutions, speak correctly about money, and ideally develop some visible seriousness, law, finance, philanthropy, art, publishing, civic life, or at the very least a practiced form of dignified stewardship. That expectation could sit heavily on sons and daughters alike, though in different ways. Sons were often burdened with continuity more directly. Even in households that believed themselves modern, there could remain an unspoken hope that a son would carry the family name into the next era with visible competence. He did not necessarily have to live exactly as his father had lived, especially not in a city where industries were changing so quickly, but he did need to demonstrate that he was not merely spending a structure built by others. Daughters, meanwhile, were often educated just as fully and could become central to family influence through marriage, philanthropy, board work, culture, or their own careers. Yet they too were read through legacy, especially in the way they represented family style in public. Marriage, in that context, remained important in ways that were more subtle than old-fashioned caricature suggests. Few elite families in 1990s New York would have described marriage as a simple commercial alliance, and many people married for affection, companionship, or the ordinary reasons that people everywhere do. Yet class still mattered. Background mattered. Education mattered. Religion could matter. Family stability mattered. Even when parents claimed openness, they often had a fairly precise sense of which forms of difference they found charming and which they considered destabilizing. This did not mean that social worlds were closed in the rigid way they might once have been. The decade had already loosened many barriers. Money itself could transform a person's prospects dramatically, and new elite circles formed through work, media, real estate, and finance as much as through pedigree. But marriage still acted as one of the main ways wealth either consolidated or dispersed itself. A spouse did not merely join the family. They changed its future tone. They altered where holidays were spent, how grandchildren were raised, which institutions were favored, which friendships deepened, and how comfortably money would be spoken about at the dinner table. You can see, then, why wedding culture in this world could become almost unbearably charged. The ceremony itself might be lovely, expensive, and outwardly serene, but around it were years of evaluation, compromise, hope, and private judgment. Where was it held? Who attended? Did the match feel equal? Was the new family suitably steady? Would the couple live in New York? Did they have a moral center or simply style? These are not especially romantic questions, but families asked them because they understood that private emotion and family structure are never entirely separable when great wealth is involved. Even the apartment could become part of legacy planning. A grand co-op or townhouse was not merely valuable real estate. It could act as the physical container of family identity. Children grew up in its rooms. Dinners took place there. Art accumulated on its walls. The doormen, elevator operators, and long-serving staff of the building became quiet witnesses to the passing of decades. To lose such a place through sale, scandal, divorce, debt, or generational dispute could feel like more than a practical change. Could feel like a thinning of the family narrative itself. This helps explain why some wealthy families held on to property even when doing so became financially awkward or emotionally inconvenient. A country house might be underused. A city apartment might require endless upkeep. A summer house might no longer fit the younger generation's habits. Yet selling it could feel like surrendering a chapter of the family that could never be rewritten once lost. New money often buys property more freely. Old money, and money aspiring to become old, tends to understand property as memory made expensive. Art worked the same way, though with its own complications. Collections in elite New York were often presented as evidence of taste, cultivation, and historical seriousness. They certainly served that role, but they also functioned as portable legacy. Paintings and objects could outlast people, connect generations, and create the impression that a family belonged not merely to commerce, but to culture. A child growing up among certain pictures or sculptures learned, wordlessly, what kind of world they were expected to inhabit. The objects were not neutral decorations. They were lessons in continuity. Yet art could also expose disagreement within families. One generation might collect with restraint and patience. The next might find the rooms oppressive, the style dated, the maintenance burdensome, or the values encoded in the collection no longer fully convincing. The same was true of charitable foundations, another major instrument of legacy. On paper, a foundation might represent generosity and civic duty. In practice, it also offered a family a structure through which its name could survive, its descendants could remain linked, and its wealth could acquire moral language. Meetings, grants, trusteeships, naming opportunities, these turned private money into something that seemed public-minded and historically anchored. This did not mean philanthropy was insincere. Often it was deeply sincere. Hospitals were improved, museums sustained, schools supported, research advanced, social services expanded. The institutions benefited in real ways. But from the family side, philanthropy also provided one of the safest available answers to a difficult question. What should wealth mean beyond comfort? A foundation allowed money to become purpose, at least in part. It gave younger generations a reason to gather around something more dignified than inheritance alone. It also softened public suspicion. A rich family attached to good works could appear less like a private monarchy and more like a civic actor. Still, foundations brought their own tensions. Younger family members did not always share older priorities. Some wanted more aggressive giving. Some wanted different causes. Some were bored. Some felt trapped in ceremonial roles. Others took to it intensely, using family money to build real expertise and moral seriousness of their own. The point is that legacy was never static. It had to be negotiated repeatedly. Wealth did not flow through generations like water through a pipe. It changed shape as it met different personalities, different marriages, different economic eras, and different moral vocabularies. Trusts and estate planning, though less visible, were perhaps the most direct expression of these anxieties. Lawyers specializing in family wealth occupied a world where tax law, emotional diplomacy, and private history merged. The richest New Yorkers spent a great deal of time thinking about structures the public would never see. How assets should be divided, when children should gain access, who would control what, how to prevent a fortune from dissolving through divorce, lawsuits, or folly, and how to encourage responsibility without producing dependence so complete that initiative died. There was no perfect formula. Give too freely, and one risked raising heirs unable to live with limits. Restrict too tightly, and resentment could harden into lifelong fracture. This may be one of the least glamorous but most revealing facts about the rich. They worried constantly about what money would do to love. Not always in those exact words, but the concern was there. Did a child love the parent, or the shelter the parent provided? Did siblings feel affection, or merely coexist inside a future struggle over property and memory? Did a spouse feel devotion, or comfort? Did friends care, or simply remain near because wealth made proximity pleasant? The more resources a family had, the harder it could become to interpret motive with full confidence. That uncertainty could produce both generosity and control. Some parents gave lavishly in the hope that abundance would create ease and loyalty. Others withheld, lectured, structured, and tested, hoping to raise children who would not dissolve into entitlement. Neither strategy guaranteed peace. The city was full of wealthy families who appeared harmonious in public while privately navigating rivalries, grievances, disappointments, and old emotional wounds sharpened by money's practical consequences. By the 1990s, divorce had become a major force in this world as well. Earlier elite culture often tolerated unhappy marriages for the sake of continuity, but by the late 20th century separations and remarriages were far more visible. Wealth made divorce both easier and more complicated. Easier because separate lives could be financed at a very high level. More complicated because property, children, reputation, and social alliances all had to be redistributed without making the family look too broken. A divorced couple might maintain extraordinary public civility for years because the alternative would damage not only them, but the intergenerational architecture around them. And then there was the matter of names. A family name in elite New York functioned almost like a private currency. Some names opened institutional doors long after the original fortune had changed shape. Others were still in the process of becoming resonant. By the 1990s, newer fortunes were learning how to turn money into name recognition through philanthropy, real estate, media presence, cultural involvement, and strategic social placement. That process could be quick, but not instant. A building could carry a surname within months. A family identity convincing enough to outlast fashion took much longer. This is why older elites sometimes seemed cautious around obvious self-display. They understood that noise could buy attention, but not always durability. What lasted, if anything lasted, was the slow conversion of private success into a public story that other institutions would continue telling after the family itself had changed. A named chair at a university, a museum wing, a long-standing board relationship, a foundation with coherent work, an apartment known for a certain quality of entertaining, children who behaved as though they understood their place in a longer line. These were all part of the same project. Of course, not every rich family wanted this. Some preferred immediate pleasure over continuity. Some had made money too recently or too exuberantly to care much about legacy in the older sense. Some simply assumed the money would always be there. In the prosperity of the 1990s, that assumption could seem plausible. Bonuses rose, markets swelled, real estate looked strong, luxury spending flourished, and the decade's general confidence encouraged the belief that upward motion was almost natural. It was possible, in such a climate, to mistake an era for a guarantee. But older New York had long memories. Families who had seen earlier crashes, slower decades, and social embarrassment understood that fortune was never as permanent as an address made it seem. This is part of what gave the rich their particular mix of confidence and nervousness. They lived beautifully, certainly, but beneath that beauty was often a trained awareness of how quickly reputation and security could shift. They knew that wealth had to be administered, narrated, and defended. Left alone, it did not necessarily become heritage. It might simply become residue. And that is why the effort to create lasting family worlds could become so intense. Parents corrected children's manners not because manners were trivial, but because they believed small habits preserved large structures. Dinner tables mattered because they trained conversation. Charity mattered because it taught obligation. Schools mattered because they bound families into future networks. Homes mattered because they stabilized memory. Art mattered because it implied standards beyond commerce. Summer houses mattered because repetition made belonging feel natural. Every piece of the lifestyle was doing double duty, offering comfort in the present while quietly preparing a claim on the future. Yet the future had its own character, and by the late 1990s it was beginning to press in with unusual speed. Technology, media acceleration, new forms of celebrity, new markets, new money, and a shifting cultural appetite for visibility were all starting to unsettle the older choreography of upper-class life. The richest New Yorkers could still build continuity, but the world they were handing on was no longer merely the old city with better tailoring. It was becoming something faster, louder, and more exposed, which meant that legacy itself was about to be tested not only inside families, but by the changing city beyond them, by the press, by the culture of public attention, by a new economy of spectacle and ambition, and by the growing sense that in New York, money could no longer rely on privacy alone to preserve its power. That changing city beyond them altered one of the oldest assumptions of elite New York, that the most powerful people could remain partly hidden while still remaining entirely influential. For generations, the ideal upper-class posture had been a kind of visible invisibility. One was known, certainly, but not overexposed. One's name circulated in the right institutions, one's photograph appeared in the appropriate places, one's address in schools and clubs did their quiet work, and beyond that there was a preference for controlled discretion. But by the late 1990s, New York was becoming less patient with restraint. Money was no longer only something to possess. Increasingly, it was something to display, narrate, and fold into the city's expanding culture of public attention. This did not happen all at once, and it did not erase the older style overnight. The Upper East Side still retained its private habits, its guarded buildings, its invitation-only interiors, its discreet loyalties and long memories. Yet around that world, other forms of wealth were becoming harder to ignore. Media executives, real estate developers, celebrity-adjacent financiers, luxury brand figures, television personalities, and a growing class of highly public dealmakers brought a different texture to elite life. They were often perfectly capable of moving through old institutions when it suited them, but they were less inclined to treat privacy as the highest sign of rank. Attention itself was becoming a useful asset. This began to reshape how the rich lived in the city, and just as importantly, how they were seen living in it. The restaurant table, the benefit, the opening night, the apartment renovation, the new building, the wedding, the divorce settlement, the real estate purchase, the art acquisition, all of these could now move more quickly into public circulation. Society pages had always existed, gossip had always existed, and New York had never lacked appetite for observing its own upper tiers. But the tone was changing. Coverage became slicker in some places, harsher in others, and more closely tied to the broader entertainment logic of the age. The rich were no longer just local aristocrats of a peculiar city. They were increasingly content for their lives to resemble a kind of serialized spectacle. For some older families, this felt indecent. Not scandalous exactly, because New York had long tolerated vanity in selective doses, but indecorous in the sense that it confused prestige with publicity. Traditional elites understood that public recognition mattered, but they preferred it filtered through institutions, museums, universities, foundations, hospitals, old clubs, serious boards, carefully edited publications. The newer media atmosphere favored repetition, personality, scene-making, and the steady conversion of private life into citywide narrative. It rewarded those willing to be seen often, named often, and discussed often. That could be useful to ambitious people. A real estate developer, for instance, might benefit enormously from being part of the city's social conversation. Public attention could support business, attract buyers, shape brand identity, and create a feeling of inevitability around one's rise. The same was true for restaurateurs, fashion figures, publishing personalities, and anyone whose social visibility could be translated into economic momentum. The city's wealthiest residents had always understood image. What changed in the 1990s was the speed and scale at which image could begin operating almost as a business unit in itself. This did not mean that old money had no image strategy. Quite the opposite. It had simply learned to hide strategy behind continuity. A family could support institutions for decades, host the right dinners, place children in the right schools, marry plausibly, and maintain a home whose rooms quietly taught visitors what sort of people lived there. This too was image-making, but it was slower, cooler, and less eager to name itself. The 1990s introduced a noisier rival approach, one in which success did not always wait for the patient approval of old gatekeepers. If enough attention could be generated, enough luxury attached to it, and enough money moved through the city's visible channels, social legitimacy could begin to arrive faster than earlier elites found comfortable. One effect of this was a subtle shift in architecture and interiors. The older Manhattan ideal, especially in certain co-ops and townhouses, had favored discretion from the street and a kind of layered privacy within. A grand apartment might be magnificent, but it often hid its magnificence behind formal thresholds. By the late 1990s, however, a different luxury language was increasingly visible in penthouses, newer buildings, and aggressively renovated homes. More glass, larger entertaining spaces, gym rooms, screening rooms, vast closets, baths designed as sanctuaries, and kitchens that could function both for domestic life and for image. Wealth began to feel less inherited room and more curated experience. That aesthetic change mattered because it reflected a deeper social shift. Older interiors were often meant to suggest duration. Newer ones increasingly suggested customization and mastery. The owner was not only displaying taste. They were displaying the capacity to bend the city to their preferences. A traditional apartment might say, "We belong here." A newer luxury residence might say, "This city now adapts to us." The distinction is subtle, but in New York's elite culture it was meaningful. One speaks the language of stewardship. The other speaks the language of conquest. Conquest, of course, has its own vulnerabilities. The more public one's wealth becomes, the more it can be resented, imitated, exaggerated, or cut down. By the 1990s, that tension was visible in the way tabloids and glossy magazines alike approached the city's elite. The same publication culture that celebrated high-profile success could also mock it, expose it, or turn it into a cartoon. A gaudy renovation, a flashy acquisition, an overmanaged wedding, an awkward appearance at a charity event, or a social misstep in the wrong room could all become material. In this sense, public wealth invited faster judgment than discreet wealth had once needed to endure. And yet many people accepted that bargain because visibility offered something older forms of prestige did not always provide: speed. One could rise faster in public than in private society. A person who would have waited years for acceptance in certain old circles might, through repeated media presence, high-value real estate, fashionable hosting, and strategic philanthropic gestures, become part of the city's upper visual culture in much less time. They might not be loved in every old drawing room, but they could become unavoidable. In a changing New York, that was often enough. This began affecting younger generations in particular. Children of the wealthy were growing up in a city where old discretion still held value, but celebrity culture and public branding were pressing ever closer. They attended the same schools and summer houses as earlier elite children, yet the surrounding world now offered different scripts for ambition. To be rich no longer meant only inheriting a private standard. It could also mean becoming publicly recognizable in one's own right. That possibility altered how some young people imagined adulthood. Finance, fashion, media, nightlife, luxury branding, publishing, entertainment. These fields promised not just money, but a named life. The result was a quiet generational tension. Parents who had spent decades teaching composure now found themselves raising children in a city that increasingly rewarded projection. A daughter might still be expected to marry well, dress correctly, and serve on the right committee, but she might also have opportunities in media or fashion that made public identity more tempting. A son might still be groomed for law, banking, or real estate, yet now there were versions of those worlds that operated through personality as much as through institution. The old ideal of being known by the right people was beginning to compete with the newer temptation of being known by everyone. Not everyone welcomed that shift. Many of the wealthiest New Yorkers remained deeply committed to privacy, and for good reason. Public attention can distort the very thing it illuminates. Once a family becomes too visible, its rituals begin to harden into performance. Weddings become stories before they are memories. Homes become statements before they are lived spaces. Philanthropy risks looking strategic even when sincere. Children become symbols before they understand themselves. Marriages become brands. Even grief can be forced into public form. The old elite instinct for discretion had developed not only from snobbery, but from a practical understanding that a life seen too closely can become harder to inhabit honestly. Still, the city moved in the other direction. Luxury retail expanded. Hotel culture changed. Nightlife grew more theatrically exclusive in some settings and more visibly interlinked with money in others. Certain restaurants and clubs now mattered partly because they generated scene, not merely because they served good food or offered privacy. The wealthy did not stop caring about each other's opinions, but they increasingly had to care about the broader currents of taste moving through media and commerce. One could no longer remain entirely inside an old social circuit and assume that this alone defined the city's upper world. This makes the 1990s especially fascinating as a moment of overlap. The old codes were still in force, but the new codes were arriving fast enough to unsettle them. That created mixed rooms, benefits where inherited names sat beside aggressively recent fortunes, dinners where old hostesses included people they might once have dismissed, clubs debating whom to admit, schools receiving children from families whose money was beyond question but whose style remained uncertain, magazine editors deciding which houses and which women and which men would symbolize the decade's version of wealth. Those mixed rooms could be tense, but they were also remarkably educational. They forced old money to admit that wealth no longer needed its complete blessing to become powerful. They forced new money to realize that money alone could not always create depth, ease, or durability. And they forced the city as a whole to renegotiate what upper-class life was supposed to look like as it entered a more exposed age. One of the most revealing arenas for this renegotiation was charity. Benefits and boards had long allowed the wealthy to turn private resources into public virtue while strengthening their own networks. In the 1990s, however, charity events also became more visibly theatrical. Decor grew grander. Guest lists became more media-conscious. Coverage increased. The event itself could function simultaneously as fundraising, social ranking, and image production. That did not strip away its seriousness, but it did change the atmosphere. A museum gala was still a museum gala. Yet it was now also an occasion in which the city's various elites, old, new, cultural, financial, social, corporate, could see and measure one another under brighter lights. This produced a subtle reversal in the meaning of elegance. In older elite culture, elegance often meant minimizing obvious effort. By the late 1990s, obvious effort could sometimes be mistaken for energy, modernity, even relevance. A more produced event, a more visible guest, a more aggressively promoted cause, a more widely photographed room, these no longer automatically read as tacky. In some settings, they simply read as current. The older preference for understatement did not disappear, but it began to look to some people like reticence, and to others like class confidence. Much depended on who was interpreting the signal. That same uncertainty touched fashion, too. Elite dressing in Manhattan had long depended on codes of restraint, quality, and fit. But the 1990s saw luxury branding become more overt in the broader culture, and with it came a renewed question. How much should wealth show that it is wealth? The answer varied sharply by circle. Some women and men continued to value quiet fabrics, excellent tailoring, and the sort of objects only similarly trained eyes would recognize. Others welcomed more visible signs. The right designers, the right jewelry, the right accessories, the right combinations of modernity and expense. The boundary between confidence and overstatement remained active, but the city tolerated louder answers than it once had. Even children's lives were touched by these changes. Schools that had once functioned mainly as private sorting institutions now operated in a world more saturated by money, media, and career visibility. Adolescents from wealthy families were not just comparing tutors, houses, and summer plans. They were also absorbing new ideas about fame, branding, and self-presentation. Family legacy still mattered, but the broader culture increasingly suggested that personal visibility might matter just as much. That could make inherited privilege feel less stable. A family name was valuable, yes, but now the young also had to consider what kind of public self they might need to build alongside it. And as the decade advanced, the city's own confidence intensified. Crime had fallen. Markets had rewarded aggression. Luxury development was moving. Neighborhoods were changing. Consumption felt culturally central. It became easier, in such an atmosphere, to imagine that wealth would continue expanding and that the forms it took would become only bolder, more integrated with media, more openly admired. This encouraged a certain looseness. People spent more freely, renovated more ambitiously, hosted more visibly, and in some cases began to treat the city less as a place that imposed limits and more as a platform for display. Yet New York has always had a way of punishing overconfidence, not always immediately, but with patience. One reason older elites could appear cautious was that they remembered this. They understood that the city's appetite for glamour coexisted with its appetite for reversal. The same newspapers and dinner tables that praised a rise could enjoy a fall. The same institutions that welcomed money could cool if embarrassment became too public. The same social world that seemed expansive in good years could become narrower and more judgmental when fortunes changed. That is why the richest New Yorkers, even at their most confident, kept lawyers close, reputations curated, and information tightly managed. They knew that the city was generous to success only so long as success remained plausible, disciplined, and legible enough not to offend its deeper sense of hierarchy. What looked like invincibility was often simply very expensive vigilance. And that vigilance became even more necessary as the line between society, business, and celebrity thinned further. By the end of the decade, one could already feel the old order straining. Not collapsing, not disappearing, but stretching to accommodate a world in which a luxury apartment might function as personal brand, a marriage as public narrative, a gala as media event, a financier as semi-celebrity, and a family name as something needing not only inheritance, but ongoing publicity to remain powerful. In that environment, even the daily rituals of wealthy life began to change their texture. A dinner reservation was no longer just a dinner reservation. It might be an appearance. A charity committee was no longer just a committee. It might be a stage. A home renovation was no longer simply domestic improvement. It might become a published expression of self. The city had not stopped sorting its rich. It had simply given them a brighter, less forgiving set of mirrors in which to watch themselves being sorted. And once those mirrors were in place, another question became harder to ignore. If the rich were increasingly living inside public images, curated, photographed, circulated, discussed. What happened when those images met the less polished realities of class difference all around them? Because the 1990s were prosperous for many at the top, but New York was never composed only of penthouses, summer houses, and gala tables. The same city that cushioned the wealthy also relied on a vast service world, a housing crisis, unequal schools, strained public systems, and neighborhoods experiencing the decades' transformations very differently, which meant that elite comfort always rested beside sharper forms of urban reality than its own interiors preferred to admit. That sharper urban reality was never entirely absent from elite life, even when the architecture of privilege worked hard to soften it. The richest New Yorkers in the 1990s did not float above the city in some entirely separate dimension. They were carried through it, protected within it, served by it, and in many cases sincerely attached to it. But the city they experienced was filtered through layers of access that made inequality feel both near and strangely distant at the same time. A wealthy woman stepping into a black car outside a doorman building on Park Avenue could travel only a few minutes and enter a hospital fundraiser where speeches would be made about public need, urban hardship, and civic responsibility. She might give generously, serve conscientiously, and believe deeply in the institution's mission. All of that could be true. Yet the route there had still been managed from elevator to curb to car to private entrance. She lived in a city dense with human friction, but much of the friction had been professionally removed before it reached her directly. This is not an accusation so much as a structural fact. Extreme wealth in New York did not merely purchase luxury, purchased filtration. Noise was filtered, delay was filtered, danger was filtered or at least redistributed. The random demands of shared urban life were softened by staff, drivers, private schools, private doctors, private clubs, and private networks of advice. The result was not complete separation from the city, but a highly edited version of it, one in which many of the burdens carried by ordinary residents were encountered mainly as abstractions, newspaper topics, philanthropic concerns, or passing visual impressions from the back seat of a car. And yet the wealthy did see things. They saw men sleeping on grates in winter. They saw crowded sidewalks just beyond the insulated hush of luxury retail. They saw workers entering buildings through service doors while they entered through main lobbies. They saw neighborhoods changing, sometimes improving by the standards of property value and perceived safety, sometimes losing the very textures that had once made the city feel alive and mixed and unpredictable. They were not blind, but seeing and inhabiting are not the same act. One can observe inequality every day and still remain buffered from what it means to live inside it. This is why philanthropy mattered so much to elite self-understanding. It allowed the rich to acknowledge the city's harsher realities without surrendering their own position within them. Supporting hospitals, schools, museums, public spaces, housing efforts, or social services enabled people of wealth to interpret their privilege as stewardship rather than mere insulation. In many cases, that interpretation had substance. Institutions truly did depend on major gifts. Urban life was materially altered by wealthy donors, often for the better. Yet philanthropy also made inequality narratively bearable. It translated a city of sharp divisions into a city of solvable needs, one gala and one campaign at a time. The limits of that frame were visible, however, in domestic life. The richest households depended on labor that was intimate, constant, and often undervalued by the standards of the worlds it sustained. Housekeepers, nannies, cooks, drivers, doormen, porters, assistants, dog walkers, florists, caterers, cleaners, and maintenance workers formed the hidden skeleton of elite comfort. These workers often knew the rhythms of wealthy life better than the wealthy themselves. They knew when a marriage was failing before close friends did. They knew which child was easiest, which child was fragile, which parent was kind, which one tipped badly, which one drank too much, which guests treated staff properly, and which had mistaken money for permission. In another sort of documentary, this might become a story of villains and victims, but the reality was usually more complicated and more mundane. Many rich families were genuinely loyal to long-serving staff. Children sometimes formed deep attachments to nannies. Doormen were remembered by name, asked after, tipped generously, and trusted with the minute choreography of daily life. Some employers supported staff through illness, immigration paperwork, school advice, and family emergencies. There could be affection, dependency, gratitude, and stability. But these relationships remained structured by asymmetry. One family owned the apartment. The other entered it to keep it functioning. One had privacy as a right. The other preserved privacy as part of the job. That distinction becomes more revealing the longer one sits with it. The wealthiest New Yorkers could experience themselves as refined, charitable, even emotionally generous, while remaining dependent on forms of labor that made their refinement possible. A beautifully calm dinner party rested on cooks, serving staff, floral preparation, cleaning, coordination, and often the invisible emotional discipline of workers whose own lives might involve long commutes, cramped housing, childcare problems, and economic uncertainty. The elegance of the evening was real. So was the unequal scaffolding beneath it. Children often absorbed this arrangement before they fully understood it. They grew up being cared for by people who were not their parents yet were essential to the texture of daily life. A nanny might know a child's moods better than either parent did. A housekeeper might remember birthdays, clothing sizes, food aversions, sleeping troubles, school anxieties, and the precise way a bedroom should look before bedtime. For some wealthy children, this produced a kind of divided intimacy. They were deeply loved in practical ways by people whose names would not appear in the family history as prominently as the grandparents, the apartment, or the schools. That emotional geography could be tender, but it could also be destabilizing. It taught children, often without words, that love and service might arrive in the same body. It taught them that the people who soothed, fed, and organized their days often went home to other neighborhoods and other forms of life entirely. Some children responded with warmth and loyalty. Others learned entitlement so seamlessly that it barely registered as cruelty. Much depended on the parents, on household culture, on the staff themselves, and on whether the family treated labor as something merely purchased or as something requiring reciprocal respect. Even within the same building, class could move vertically. The penthouse and the basement were parts of one machine. Service elevators, staff entrances, delivery systems, building management offices, and maintenance areas all formed a second anatomy beneath the visible one. Elegant pre-war buildings were masterpieces of separation. Residents inhabited spacious rooms, controlled light, silence, and view, while another whole world of movement made the experience possible out of sight. One of the truest things about rich life in 1990s New York is that it was supported by carefully designed invisibility. That invisibility extended into the broader patterns of urban change. The 1990s are often remembered, with some justification, as a decade of falling crime and rising confidence in New York. To many affluent residents, the city seemed to be getting cleaner, safer, and more usable. Areas once approached with caution became more desirable. Luxury retail strengthened. Restaurants multiplied. Real estate optimism deepened. But such improvement was unevenly experienced. What felt like revival from one vantage point could feel like pressure or displacement from another. Rents rose. Neighborhood character changed. Certain forms of disorder were pushed elsewhere rather than resolved. The city was improving, yes, but improvement is not a neutral word when property and class sit so close together. The wealthy benefited immensely from this transformation. Safer streets expanded the geography of pleasure. More neighborhoods became potential zones of investment, dining, shopping, and eventual residence. Children could move through certain areas more freely than before. Developers sensed opportunity. Institutions attracted more donors. The city's upper tiers increasingly felt vindicated in their attachment to urban living. Manhattan no longer seemed to some like a place one tolerated for business and escaped from at every opportunity. It became more fully a luxury environment in its own right. That shift had emotional consequences. Earlier generations of wealth had often treated the city with a mix of love and guardedness. By the later 1990s, some of the richest New Yorkers had begun to feel a little more triumphant about it. The city seemed, at least from their angle, to be aligning more closely with their needs. Services improved. Security improved. Luxury development expanded. Public space in selected areas became easier to enjoy. A person could walk certain avenues with less apprehension than in earlier decades and still retreat to a private world when desired. The old tension between urban brilliance and urban inconvenience had not vanished, but privilege was increasingly winning the negotiation. Of course, this did not mean all class anxiety disappeared. In some ways it sharpened. The richer the city became at the top, the more visible wealth itself became as a force of urban design. Buildings were restored or remade. Shops changed. Certain restaurants no longer felt accessible to ordinary people except as workers. Streets took on a more polished commercial character. A wealthy resident might find this comforting. Another might quietly worry that too much polish made the city dull, or at least too legible. For all their need for safety and service, many New Yorkers of means still like to imagine that they lived in a city with edge. If the city became only a showroom, then even the rich risked losing something they valued: the sense of inhabiting a place larger, stranger, and more mixed than themselves. This is another irony worth noticing. Elite New Yorkers often wanted both insulation and authenticity. They wanted the city cleaned up, but not sterilized. They wanted neighborhood charm, but not too much unpredictability. They wanted old shops and old textures preserved, provided this preservation did not threaten property values or convenience. They wanted public vitality, but usually at a tolerable distance from the thresholds of private comfort. It is difficult to achieve all of these desires at once, and the city never entirely managed it. Still, the wealthy were well positioned to enjoy the resulting compromises more than most. Race, too, shaped this urban arrangement, even when elite society preferred to speak in the smoother language of class, taste, schools, and neighborhoods. New York's upper world in the 1990s remained heavily marked by long-standing patterns of exclusion, however much these patterns were evolving. Clubs, schools, buildings, and social networks were more open than they had once been, but not evenly so, and certainly not beyond the influence of old assumptions. People could behave impeccably, possess extraordinary wealth, and still encounter layers of scrutiny different from those applied to white counterparts of similar means. Elite life prided itself on sophistication, yet often carried forward older boundaries in softened, deniable forms. That matters because the filthy rich were never one single group. Their experiences differed by religion, ethnicity, race, profession, family history, and how new the money was. Some families moved with the calm of total belonging. Others moved with equal wealth but a slightly keener awareness that certain rooms were still evaluating them. By the 1990s, that evaluation could rarely be expressed openly in the old way, but it had not fully vanished. Social confidence, then, was not distributed evenly even among the very rich. Some had money plus inheritance plus cultural ease. Others had money plus scrutiny. Meanwhile, outside elite spaces, the decade's economic story was far less soothing. Plenty of New Yorkers worked long hours merely to remain in place. Public schools varied enormously in quality. Housing pressure intensified. Service sector workers made the city function while living far from the neighborhoods they helped sustain. A wealthy family might think of the city as a sequence of reliable institutions and beautiful addresses. A worker in that same city might experience it as transit delays, rent anxiety, crowded apartments, and little margin for error. The same decade held both realities at once. The truly wealthy were not always indifferent to this. Many were intelligent enough to know that their comfort rested inside a broader and more strained civic system. Some gave seriously, advocated seriously, and served institutions with real dedication. Others preferred not to think about the larger picture unless a fundraiser, board meeting, or newspaper story required it. But even the more conscientious among them lived within structures that turned inequality into background. When a child's school problem can be solved privately, when healthcare can be accelerated privately, when public disorder can be bypassed privately, one can remain civic-minded without being forced into the rawest forms of civic dependence. And that, perhaps, is one of the core truths beneath the entire lifestyle. The richest New Yorkers were not simply buying extravagance. They were buying distance from the consequences of living in an unequal city. Not complete distance, because no one in New York is ever entirely outside the city's atmosphere, but enough distance to make ordinary precarity feel like something happening in parallel rather than something shared. The elevator closed. The driver pulled away. The private school solved its own problems. The doctor returned the call. The doorman signed for the package. The housekeeper made the room serene again. The city remained intense, but its intensity reached the wealthy through layers of cushioning. Still, the city had a way of insisting on itself. A labor dispute, a transit disruption, a public health concern, a high-profile crime, a school controversy, a political fight over policing, housing, or development. Any of these could pierce the illusion that private systems were sufficient. Elite New Yorkers might prefer to treat public life as backdrop, yet public life kept shaping the conditions of their comfort. Buildings required city systems. Staff required transit. Property values depended on neighborhood trajectories. Institutions depended on policy. The fantasy of full separation could never quite hold. That tension also affected how the rich imagined their own morality. It is easier to enjoy privilege when one believes it has been earned and that one is using it responsibly. Many wealthy New Yorkers genuinely thought of themselves in those terms. They worked hard, supported institutions, maintained standards, employed people, gave money, and contributed to the city's cultural life. From within that frame, wealth could appear not as extraction but as stewardship. There is truth in that view, but only a partial truth. The city also allowed fortunes to grow through financial structures, property systems, labor conditions, and inherited advantages that were hardly available to everyone. Responsibility existed, but so did insulation. If this sounds less romantic than penthouses and gala dresses, that is because daily life at the top always included such contradictions. The rich could be generous and sheltered, civic-minded and self-protective, refined and dependent on hidden inequality, sincerely attached to New York and yet insulated from much of what gave New York its pressure. Their lives were not simple hypocrisies. They were systems of managed contradiction. And it is precisely those contradictions that become most vivid when moments of crisis arrive. Prosperous decades can disguise a great deal. Good markets flatter judgment. Rising real estate values flatter taste. Social success flatters character. But once pressure enters, financial pressure, scandal, illness, political change, market shock, a public catastrophe, the hidden architecture of wealthy life becomes easier to see. Who is protected? Who is exposed? Which relationships are real? Which institutions matter? Which forms of luxury survive stress and which collapse into bad theater? By the end of the 1990s, many of the city's richest residents were still living in extraordinary confidence. Their apartments were full, their calendars crowded, their children guided into the next tier of schools and social worlds, their bodies maintained, their houses in order, their staff in place, their summer plans secure, and their names moving through the institutions that made elite New York feel stable. But beneath all of that there were already small tremors, signs that the city's new prosperity, like every prosperity before it, had created habits of certainty that would eventually be asked to justify themselves. And as those habits hardened, the lives of the very rich moved toward a revealing threshold, the moment when all the polished routines of 1990s New York, its money, manners, properties, appearances, discretion, publicity, and carefully maintained distance from ordinary urban insecurity, would begin to meet the limits of an era that had started to believe, perhaps a little too confidently, that the city's good years might simply continue. That belief, that the good years might simply continue, was one of the quiet luxuries of 1990s New York, and perhaps one of the most revealing. The very rich lived not only inside beautiful rooms and carefully managed calendars, but inside a mood. It was a mood of momentum. Money seemed abundant, property seemed dependable, prestige felt renewable, institutions still held. The city, from their vantage point, appeared to be converging with their needs. Cleaner, safer, more accommodating, more luxurious, more responsive to capital, more eager to celebrate the kinds of lives they knew how to build. And yet, looking back with a little distance, what is striking is not simply how comfortable that world was, but how constructed it was. Almost every part of it depended on maintenance. The apartment remained serene because unseen labor kept it so. The body remained polished because appointments, discipline, and money were continually invested in it. The family remained respectable because silence, coaching, strategy, and institution held the edges together. The social world remained elegant because hosts, staff, drivers, schools, clubs, lawyers, doctors, and donors all did their parts. Even the city itself, in the form the elite most enjoyed, was not a natural backdrop. It was being reshaped around security, development, service, and capital in ways that made certain forms of wealthy life easier and more pleasurable than they had been a decade earlier. So what was life really like for the filthy rich in 1990s New York? It was certainly luxurious. There is no need to pretend otherwise. They lived with a level of comfort, beauty, and logistical ease that most people could scarcely imagine. Their homes were larger, quieter, and more protected. Their children moved through curated pathways of advantage. Their time was more flexible. Their illnesses were treated faster. Their mistakes were softened by discretion. Their city, though never fully theirs, was arranged to meet them gently wherever possible. But it was also a life of management, a life of maintenance, a life of performance in the broadest and calmest sense. They were not simply rich. They were required to keep wealth legible. They had to inhabit it correctly, display it with the right degree of confidence, pass it on without letting it go slack or vulgar, and preserve the impression that this way of living was not only desirable but natural. That required taste, discipline, patience, social intelligence, and often a private tolerance for anxiety that the glossy images of the decade rarely captured. The contradiction at the heart of it all is what makes the subject linger. The richest New Yorkers were, in one sense, more protected than almost anyone else in the city. But they were also deeply exposed to forms of judgment particular to their world. Their houses were judged, their marriages judged, their children judged, their bodies judged, their dinner tables judged, their charity judged, their taste judged, their rise judged, and eventually, when the city was in the mood for it, their falls judged too. Wealth insulated them from ordinary precarity, but it never freed them from the need to remain convincing inside their own class system. That may be why the era now feels so oddly dreamlike. In memory, it gleams. The black cars, the polished lobbies, the well-cut coats, the flowers in the apartment hall, the Hamptons weekends, the benefits under soft light, the confidence of a city turning expensive and calling it renewal. But once you look a little longer, the dream reveals its mechanisms. Staff moving quietly before dawn. Children being trained into inherited ease. Women translating pressure into grace. Men translating risk into composure. Families trying to convert money into permanence. A whole urban aristocracy balancing luxury against insecurity, publicity against discretion, appetite against standards, and private comfort against a city whose inequalities made that comfort possible. In the end, perhaps the most accurate thing to say is that the very rich in 1990s New York did not simply possess a better version of ordinary life. They inhabited a different structure of life altogether. One built from access, repetition, invisibility, and carefully preserved illusion. They lived closer to beauty and often farther from inconvenience. But they also lived inside systems so curated that even spontaneity had to be prepared in advance. Their freedom was real, though rarely uncomplicated. Their world was glamorous, though never effortless in the way it wished to appear. And their New York, however magnificent, was only one version of the city among many. That is what makes the subject worth lingering over in the quiet. Not the envy of it, and not the easy condemnation either, but the fuller human shape of it. How privilege arranges a day. How money edits a city. How elegance can be sincere and still depend on inequality. How luxury can ease the body and tighten the soul. How a family can have everything needed for comfort and still worry constantly about continuity, image, and love. And how an era that seemed so secure could, even at its most polished, carry within it the same old truth that shadows every rich world eventually. Nothing stays effortlessly golden for long. If there was one thing people today may still misunderstand about that world, it is that wealth did not remove history. It only cushioned the experience of moving through it. The city still changed. Generations still disappointed one another. Bodies still aged. Marriages still frayed. New money still challenged old codes. Public attention still turned admiration into scrutiny. And the larger New York beyond the lobby doors, restless, unequal, inventive, unforgiving, remained the true ground on which all that polished private life had to stand. That may be the most enduring image to leave with. A lamp still on in a grand apartment late at night, high above the avenue, while below it the city keeps moving in all its other registers. A doorman at the desk, a driver waiting outside, a housekeeper who will come in early, a woman placing jewelry back into a case, a man loosening his tie after a dinner where everyone seemed perfectly at ease, children asleep in rooms full of inherited softness. And beyond the windows, a New York far larger than the one they could control, already carrying the next decade toward them. What part of that world feels hardest to imagine living inside? The luxury itself, or the constant effort it took to make that luxury look natural? And if you enjoy this kind of slow, careful history, there is more to return to when you want another quiet descent into a past that looked simpler from a distance than it ever truly was.